Yep.
All right. That started. I think it's that. Welcome everyone at the March 29th community meeting for multi-networking project. Today agenda, we want to talk about some stuff related to what we did yesterday. But the first thing is we are increasing the frequency of the meeting. So it's going to be moved to a weekly meeting from bi-weekly. So be mindful of that, and we try to kind of speed up our work around this project. Uh, uh, if there are any other agenda items you wish to add, just feel free to add them. We have some topics to discuss around what we already did. So let's go over there, and then at the end, we're going to move back to our regular discussion about the API. So the first thing is something that kind of came up through Slack channels discussions where how the whole kind of object can be used and what does it mean. And I want to kind of maybe give more description of that. Let me move back to the cap that we are working on, to the doc we are working on. What I did, I slightly enhanced it with additional examples. What I want to say is the pod networks parameters field is a optional field, and you can imagine about this as a enhancements to someone's implementation. That's kind of, and correct me if someone thinks differently. I just want to kind of provide an example of how this can be used with or without the parameters reference. So most of us are used to something like Multus, where you have a plethora of options, combinations of what you can configure with multiple CNIs configuration, or even different ways of chaining things. So you can go, there is a lot of flexibility configuration, all this. And this is where the parameters ref is for. This is for how you would reference this network attachment definition with whatever configuration you wish to have. And this is how you can create your various versions of a pod network. But that is not the only way to go about this. The other way to go about this is just go very simple. And I'm gonna use here an example as a something like a vSwitch. Imagine you have and I'm borrowing here, I think, Nathan, something similar to what you're thinking of doing, where imagine I have a implementation where I do not expose any configuration. I know how everything is connected. I do everything in the same way. My network is to identify separate networks for isolation. That's the only reason I have my pod networks. And to have a means to just pipe connection to a specific pods, and to have a means to identify which pods which want which network. And for that reason, since I don't have any extra configuration, the only thing I really need is how and who's going to handle IPAM. I see there is a mistake here, so let me just quickly fix that. It's not internal. Uh, in that case, I just need a means to, as I mentioned, reference who's connecting what, because the underlying infrastructure implementation is done in it's done in generic way that it's always the same, where I'm just piping a connection from my vSwitch to my pod. And imagine now in my implementation, I make it so that each pod network has its own ID within my implementation, in such a way that all the networks are isolated, and then they are uniquely identifiable. Is that clear, or did I um, uh, is that somehow clear for folks?
It makes sense. The one question I've got is, so you've got your provider there that indicates that this is just a vSwitch or whatever it might be.
No.
Is the kubelet
So
expected to? Sorry, go on.
in the provider will mean that my implementation, and I'm like company X, that's my implementation to indicate that's how I'm handling this network, and I know what to do with the rest, right? And
So
that only indicates who's doing it, handling it, not
so
how.
but does the kubelet understand that provider field and therefore know who to call out to in order to actually implement the network?
No, kubelet has nothing to do here, right? So it should be, depending on how you okay, maybe step back, depending on how you are handling how you piping and handling the whole administration of your data plane, right, in your node. And that's something that we need to get to drill down to, of how far we want to engage kubelet to this whole thing, right, or the CNI, right? Right now we have the very straightforward approach, and the way we have like some of the implementation done it is in a ways where it's even Multus moving towards the ways where we have a daemon set, and the CNI is only a just a small client, gRPC client, that just calls to that daemon, and the daemon does the whole thing, and it has the full knowledge. So basically my CNI is just to send signal with which namespace I am to operate on, and that's it. And the rest is handled by the daemon set, which is a fully fledged agent which access to Kubernetes API, and it can do everything. And this is a common pattern across implementations, which can be done that way. And of course, we have Michael here, which maybe in a future CNI can change, and it can adapt to the spot network, where instead of doing this agent thing, maybe it can be more elaborate and done directly in the CNI. And this is up to again implementation, because this is just an API, and then we need to define an implementation defines how it's going to be later on done. All right. Did I answer your question, Pete?
Yeah, that makes sense. So in my mind, provider is just a tag. And from the point of view of the kubelet, well, it's got a tag and it's just going to pass that tag over an API and it doesn't understand it. So so it is up to the implementer to put something behind that API on the kubelet.
Yeah, and basically,
so the CNI, whatever.
I'm not sure whether kubelet would even pass that around anywhere, because you have to be backward compatible. So the CNI config doesn't go away with this, at least initially. I don't think this will go away unless yeah, that's my thinking, because it's integrated with CRI as well. So it's not just so that we can get rid of CNI or just straight away change it. So now pass this instead of something else. So be mindful of that this is just an API thing, that's NPI, and I would not think kubelet will pass it unless we will have a discussion around this, and this can be changed, and
Okay.
it should maybe. But for now, I don't see this being passed around by kubelet. Tom.
Okay.
Tomo, you had a hand.
Oh, yep. I'm so looking above the YAML file, this provider field seems to be the optional. So
Yeah.
what does it mean, the empty? Is this for the kind of wildcard or some? I don't know.
So I gave it a description. I'm not sure whether I did it right or not, but yes, it can be a wildcard, and basically it's like today's. Imagine today we have implementers for ingress. Same story, right? You can have an ingress implementation where it will recognize its own object, and that it's going to only handle those ingresses to which it's marked as, or it never bothers to look at the provider field, and it handles all of them. But that means that the implementation is not compatible with other implementers. So basically in one cluster, that would mean my implementation cannot coexist with other ones inside that cluster, because let's say I don't respect and I don't care about the provider field, I will implement all of them, and that means that I am not cooperating with other implementers, because whatever field you set there, I will try to use all of the pod networks, right? That's what it boils down to, and that's what I'm mentioning here, right? So it's up to implementers. It's up to the implementation to respect this field. That's what I want to say. And if that's something that's not the case, and I hope I spell this out here correctly. If not, then please refactor this. Give me suggestions on how better write it down. But that's what I would like it to be. Is that
I
clear,
have a
Tom?
little concerns about the
Yeah.
future case. So at the initial deployment of this multi network, I mean the pod network, at that time we could expect that the one provider is running in the one cluster. I mean that, for
Yeah.
example, the one Kubernetes running the one Maltus. But I'm a little bit afraid that in the future, the more than one, I mean that the two or more provider is running in the same cluster. At that time, if the provider A and the provider B have a different meaning of the wildcard, I mean that the pod A cares about the provider empty and the pod B cares about the provider empty. At that time, one pod network may consist with two or more provider network. I'm a little bit afraid of these stuff. So
But
the
that will be, Tomo, that will be on a bit pressure on the implementers. So let's say I will pick on Multus. Apologize, but I will pick on Multus. And what can it be? And you will see someone saying, "Oh, Multus doesn't cooperate with others." So that will be a con against Multus, right? So basically, you would like to remedy that so that you are not you can collaborate with other providers in the clusters. In that way, you would
but
just
from the
that will be
API
like
side,
a yeah.
but API side, the API should have provide a way to the interworking with the multiple provider, I think. So I mean that if the provider is the kinds of the non-empty, the optional, this is the required. I
Yeah,
mean that at that time,
I can
each provide the, how do I say? So currently we have the empty, and then this can interpret as the multiple meanings. And then you are thinking that the provider should care about these meaning. But so that if the provider is non-empty, at that time the one provider value is for one value. I mean that. So the Maltus, if you want, if user wants to create the Maltus network for if you create the pod network for Maltus, at that time provider filling the Maltus, and then it's okay, and then the other is ignored. So I'm a little bit afraid that if we accepting the empty and that optional, at that time the this empty having the multiple meaning, and also the you asks you mentions the empty is depend on the implementations provider. So at that time, if the two or more provider is having a different semantics for provider empty, at that time this may be getting the conflict.
So it's I see your case, and I will tell you, I will counter that with, on the other hand, with the user, with the UX of this. All right, and imagine 90% of use cases for this is going to be use only one provider. You see that, right? That the 90% of use cases out on the world, it will be, I'm gonna use just one provider. And in that case, why would even I bother to provide this and complicate my life? So that's the trade-off, right? We either force it, and let's choose one. I'm not saying, but in my opinion, having the optional serves the probably 80-90%, which will just use only one provider, and then they will never specify a name, right? And then it will be out to implementation and how they handle that. So let's it's basically pick your poison, right? At this point, either we enforce it and then we put a constraint on the user to always provide, and all the implementers always have to provide this value, or we make it optional, and only when you really need to have coexistence within one cluster, you have to specify that. Because that's what it boils down to, right? That's why I think it's a matter of ease of use. And in most cases that will be that case where I don't care about the providers because I'm gonna have just one in the cluster and don't worry about it. And implementation then can handle that same way, right? Where you can have a flag in your configuration stating, okay, in this cluster you have to be compatible with other things. So just ensures you that you only look at the provider specified networks, or you don't, right? So basically up to your implementation that you can support both cases.
But
You see that? Yeah.
But shouldn't the API really describe how the implementation should behave and not the other way around?
In
So,
this case,
I
but how would you enforce that differently on the APIs here? And yes, and this is where Tomo is saying, right? Let's make this enforce, and then every provider should have its own unique value. We can do that. But again, this boils down to the user experience, because that's what it will boil down to only. Because this is very if we go to what you're saying, Olaf, that it has to I think that was you, Olaf, I'm not sure.
Yeah, sure.
If we are saying that we should enforce it, let's do that then. Let's change the optionality and go towards that.
I'm not even sure if it's really about the enforcement. It's I thought that the comment actually is about that it just needs to be properly described what it means if a field is optionally, if it's empty, and so on. So what is expected from the implementation on the behavior? That you could actually kind of, according to the API, implement this. It shouldn't be so that you have kind of field here in this API, and then it's up to the implementation how to handle this. I think that wouldn't work.
But that's
interoperable.
It will be all the fields are always like that, right? Our IPAM 4, it will be up to implementation whether they respect it or not. Same story. So on that one, whether we enforce it or not, that can be said with every field, even if it's mandatory. We can say that whether implementation supports it or not. This is a recommendation for that field. So right, you do see that, right? If we say whether implementation respects it or we enforce it or not.
I understood your point. So the initially maybe the user may provide the one provider for in the cluster, and then let's see. So maybe the if user is trying to deploy the 2 or more provider in the one cluster at that time, we should care about that as the next version API.
That's what I'm getting at, right? So I don't want to enforce now every implementation, like let's say Multus, whenever this comes out, now Multus, the first thing they should have to do is implement provider and how to support it, right? They don't, right? That can be something down the line when they will feel that, when you will feel that, okay, now we want to be, so there are issues in GitHub stating, oh, you're not compatible with implementation blah or foo or whatever, right? So then you go and okay, and you can prioritize this accordingly, right? That gives you the leeway on how to do that. Does that sound?
Yeah,
go.
Is the parameter ref any structure, or must it be key value?
What do you mean? This has to be an explicit pointer to an object. What do you mean?
Yeah.
Key value?
But how, as you have specified it in the example, you have only like key value 4 times. Is it possible to have an array or a sub-object or any object? And if it was JSON, would it be an empty object where you can fill in any structure in it?
So whatever this object is up to you. And then that object can have additional references. I don't think we should have a list here because that means that why would you want to have a list here? You reference to, so a pod network should be described by one object, a custom object that you wish. And then if you want to have more references, more configuration, do it in that object, right?
Yeah, so the answer is what is in the provider ref is key value, nothing else. No list,
so
no
this is
sub-object, nothing. Key
that's
value.
true, yes, that's
okay,
true. So
good.
basically this is a specified structure, right? So this is how you would describe uniquely an object in Kubernetes. So this is a group, kind, name, and namespace, if it's namespaced, right? So those are like generic ways. This is a common pattern in Kubernetes on how you would point to a specific object.
Okay, good, thanks.
All right. I think the next pointer was anything else on the params and what I said before we move on. And I want to kind of describe this, kind of head explanation on this, so that everyone will is on the same page on what we are thinking here. All right. So the next topic was, I think, Pete, was you about the use cases, right? User stories.
Yeah, that's right. So I've been asking around here about user stories, and this is kind of following up on our thing in Slack. I don't think anything we've said so far really impinges upon the user stories I've got, but I've got some user stories from people here that I don't think are covered by the list of user stories we have now. And I'd like to kind of submit them to the group and see if we could get them added to the user stories in the KEP. I was wondering if we could do that and if there's a process. So what's the process here? I mean, I don't have them properly written up yet, I have to say. And I do want to find out a little bit more about the details of them. But my plan is what I would propose is I'll write them all up, I'll put them in a Google Doc or something and circulate them to this group, and then we'll get them into the KEP. Is that the right way to tackle it?
I would say so, yeah. That would be the best, because yeah, the KEP is out there. The current user stories that so tell you this, as I mentioned probably in the chat, the user stories were a description of what sort of use cases we want to tackle, but then the requirements were derived out of them in the level that we want to support them, right? So if we said that we want to do support a use case where, or one of the use cases were to use SRO VVFs, and how we would use the hardware-based stuff, try to pass that into the pod, it doesn't mean we wanted to support SRLV here in this effort. It just meant that this is one of the use cases, and the requirements out of this is that the IPAM has to be optional. So that, because I can pass a hardware device into the pod, which will never have an IP. And that's the requirement out of this use case. The main requirement, I would say, out of this use case, where I want to have an ability to pass an interface that will never have an IP. Okay, so that's how the use cases drive the requirements. So make sure that whatever use case you are proposing, what sort of requirements you want to add from it. That should be your because just the use case is just a driver to what the requirement has to be. Okay, and we are driving here this whole work is based on those requirements and which one we are tackling. So right now you can see on the bottom of the KEP there is a phasing that I did, and that's what I'm proposing, and we are currently focusing on the phase 1. Okay.
Yeah, and I think there are a few things that might lead to tweaking of those requirements, or potentially tweaking of those requirements. So, but let me get the user stories.
Yeah,
let me get them written up, and then we'll discuss them, and then we can take it from there. Okay, that sounds good. Thanks.
All right. Any other topics before we move on to the API discussion? No. Okay. Yet. All right. I'm moving on to the next one. Am I sharing stuff? I am sharing the doc, right? I am sharing the KEP file, right? Could someone? I think which doc am I? Oh, okay, no, not this one. Share this stuff. Okay. Now I see. So last week we ended our discussion on the conditions, and okay, I added a section to describe this, and basically when I went through the use cases, and if you look at the object itself, right, the object here, in terms of validation itself, it can be all done statically through just inside the through, even if you think about if this was a CRD, it can be done statically. What I mean, you don't need a validation webhook or anything. It can be done statically in terms of what IPAM it is. So this is just a string and two values allowed, and then provider has to be just a string. The other thing is the parameters ref, which is just as well strings. So this will be auto-validated because you have to just provide that. And I was thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would not want API, because one thing that can be done here is validate if this object exists, right? But my concern here would be the controller, the core controller, trying to import a custom CRD. I would not want to do that. I don't think we don't have Antonio here. He would probably tell us best whether that's a pattern or not. But I don't want to kind of validate if this object exists in the Kubernetes API by the controller. So basically, even if you specify this is just information for your implementation and this object handler to know how to kind of match one to the other. Any opinions on that? Are we in agreement on that one? I don't see any voices against, so I assume it's okay. So what it boils down to then, this ready condition would be only one possible fail reason, and that would be if you specify this field and you did not add the parameters ready, only then it will be a reason for the ready being false will be params not ready. So basically the parameters condition is not true. So and it's either you don't have it or it's set to false for some reason. And this check will be only done when the parameters ref is set to a non-nil value. So there is something defined here. Does that sound reasonable? Tomo, you had a question about whether this was what this exactly mean. Does that kind of clear this out?
Yeah. Today I just start to read this stuff. So, but roughly, I'm okay. So
Okay.
and then the most important things is that we need to have the description about the which status means what, and then especially this is slightly complicated. I mean that.
Yeah.
So
The ready. And as you can see here, and I even add an example here. So imagine if you don't have the params ready.
So
this one doesn't have it, right?
Making the clear, make that clear, and then also the yeah, I see. So
yeah. So basically, only if you have parameters ref, this object will be there, and then for the params ready, it means that the parameters ref is ready to use, right? So basically, whatever object you referenced, it's ready for use. Why am I doing this? My reason for this is to give ability to gate readiness of network by your implementation. That's the kind of main, as you can see, that's the main reasoning behind this whole kind of complication. Because let's assume I have my implementation is going to do something based on this additional parameter, and then I want to gate the main network by that, right? Because I have to do some operations or what's nuts. So I want to have a means to gate readiness of this object based on whatever I need to do with my custom stuff. So that's the main reason. And basically this is fully optional, but I want to have this capability too. I want to gate it, right? So before you're gonna become ready, before anything, let me check my stuff first. And then I have a generic way, because this is very generic, right? Every implementer just has to implement the same thing, which they just has to handle the params ready type of condition. And they just indicate true or false, and that will switch as well the readiness flag. So this way we have a kind of a generic interface on how I can gate the pod networks from my implementation if I need to, right? So that's the main reason on behind that. And that's why as well I want to use ready instead of accepted, because accepted is mostly just it's if I'm not mistaken, accepted is used to fully validate, and only when you do that, right? So basically, I applied an object, and then I do additional validation checks on it. And then, yes, we could use just accepted, but we don't really do much of that for this ready. Maybe in the future when we gonna have, maybe, I'm not sure, I hope not, but if we're gonna expand this spec with more fields, which would have to be validated, then probably we can introduce the accepted field if there needs to be some additional validations done. But since this there is not much to be done around this, that I think the accepted is not the right thing, and especially since the ready is to kind of gate this and be dependent on this param ready.
Just from a like philosophical standpoint,
Uh-huh.
I definitely would lean towards reducing the number of fields and parameters here,
Yeah.
because one thing I can see happening is that users pick this up, they look at a reference with all the fields, and they go bananas with them. And if it was more simplified, then, because one thing I see being a like possible reality is that
Mhm.
you know, we come up with as many ideas as we can for what needs to be in this object, and then it's just a grim reality that you have to loft more of the instructions to the implementation. So I think, yeah, if we simplify it, and we let lofting to the implementation happen where it needs to be, then we do users a favor by not over promising from a huge number of API objects. But yeah, but I see where you're coming from, Ajay.
Yeah. Okay. But basically this is where we all then have to be on guard in terms of what you're saying, because I agree with you 100%. Any additional parameters should be pushed to your implementation. That's why you see our
Yeah, totally.
object
With the param graph, yeah,
with the initial proposal, which I had like routes, gateway here, all those, we cut them out,
Yes.
and I agree on
Yeah,
that.
totally.
And because that's clean and mean and clean, that's really good. So I think we are agreeing on this one. All right. Yeah, I agree fully 100% in terms of because this should be kind of representing what can be done, what sort of configuration can be done today for the default network. And the default network you can just do this. That's it. We are expanding the whole thing with this, which kind of gateway to hopefully it's not Pandora box, but we open a gateway to you further configure your stuff. But today, default configuration of the default network can be just done that. Do I want to have IPAM done by the KCM, Kubernetes Control Manager, or not? And then whether I'm gonna do dual stack or not. And that's the only thing you can do today for the network configuration today. Okay. Moving on, the examples, conditions, the provider. I'm starting to think, should we just, since our discussion previously, should we cut it out and simplify even this? I'm not sure. Something to maybe chew on, or should we just keep it in case for future reference, even if it's currently just optional? From what I'm seeing in terms of implementation on the core side, it's irrelevant because so on the core side in case Kubernetes, this field will be just completely ignored. At least I think, because it's for the implementation. So in terms of implementation and amount of work added, there is nothing in this one. It's just a helper for all the other implementers to kind of use that. So okay, if no voices, something to think about maybe.
For
If
the
we want to-
provider, it just seems like redundant with the parameters ref, and then like what's the kind of differences between like a provider and like a map of labels?
How would I do this if I don't have any parameters ref? How would I indicate my my implementation? I don't, as I mentioned in my previous example, I don't need any parameters ref. I don't want to complicate my my implementation. My implementation is very simple. How do I indicate that this object is mine then? Mine will mean in terms of my implementation handling it.
Yeah, and I think what I was
So-
saying is like it feels like redundant or like a duplicate. That's just my like quick thoughts on the matter.
You could think, yeah, I would say that, okay, you identify your provider by the value here, right? It's network attachment definition, you definitely know it's Multus, right? But what exactly, this won't cover the case, the upper here case, this generic example where, okay, I don't have any providers. How do I indicate? I don't have any parameters in my implementation. How do I indicate that this object belongs to me, to my implementation? So that's the reason to have it, if we were to kind of have the whole provider thinking. So it's not fully redundant, Michael, because this is optional, right?
Yeah, but I think in the future, if someone, so 2 or more provider is utilizing the one shared CRD, at that time the provider is pretty useful to identify which provider is
And
going
not to
to
mention
use.
that. Fair point, good point, Tomo, yeah. There is that case as well. Yeah, you can have 2 guys using the same CRD as well. Yeah, thanks.
So maybe the params ref is kind of the additional optional information, supplying the additional information to the port network from the provider point of view.
Yeah,
I think.
that's it. That's exactly what you just said. That's hit on the nail. All right. Moving on then.
Just
So
on the
yeah.
just on the topic, so just on understanding the significance of provider here, right? So
Mhm.
if it is external anyway, the parameter reference will be always present. So I guess this parameter reference is something like pod network specific. I mean, if it is Multus, it will have network attachment definition. But if it is something external, they have their own custom object here, right? So I mean, without this parameters reference, only the Kubernetes. I mean, if only the IPAM type is Kubernetes, only then we don't have this parameters reference object. In which cases, I mean, if it is going to be external, definitely there will be some network attachment definition, right? Otherwise.
So it will be whatever you're implementing. So this is keep in mind, this are examples, and maybe I will do this because I see this might be missed. So make sure that you are aware. IPAM is completely independent out of. I will do that. Let's say Multus can just leverage the Kubernetes IPAM story and leverage that. I'm not sure that's possible. That will have to be some implementation, but IPAM doesn't indicate who is doing it. So I'm just doing something like that. So IPAM is completely independent. But now to what you're saying, this will have to be right now. I'm providing Multus network attachment definitions because this is an existing upstream example that most of us are aware of. But you can come up with your full object that's supported by your implementation, which it's not Multus, it's something that you grew created in-house, and then you can specify that.
Yeah, I can specify that in parameters reference. So I'm trying to get like what is the significance of provider here? Like if I go to parameters reference and check the kind object, then I know like what is the implementation there, right? I mean,
right, but you keep in mind we have to support all the use cases, and this use case, how would I know that this object belongs to me if my implementation doesn't provide any parameters? All right, and what Thomas said, this is an extension to what your implementation needs. It's not the indicator of your implementation, okay? Because if I let's in a case where my implementation doesn't need additional parameters, how would I then indicate that this object belongs to my provider? Right, that's the reason to have it, right? So you have to support both cases.
Do
you see that?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right, so contentious thing. Moving on, characteristic of this whole object. The 2 main things. One, I want to ensure this object is immutable. So once created, it cannot be changed. So basically my reference, my IPAM story, it's once created, it cannot be changed. You have to delete the whole object to change anything. That's one part. But then there is another bullet to this whole thing. This object cannot be removed if at least one pod is referencing it. So we need to do something and handle a case where I have a pod referencing a network, and then I cut the network out of that pod. Is that possible? So in however your implementation does it, we need to ensure that we are preventing users from, cutting out an object that's still being used by the pod. Tomo?
So who is responsible to enforce this rule? I mean that the core Kubernetes,
That will be, this
KCM
will be core object, so it should be easy to just, if you try to, I will have a flag on an object. Maybe this is something that we need to spell out here, how I will indicate that this object is used by a pod. So that's something that let me talk with, maybe someone has, unless someone has an idea over here, how we can indicate that the network is used by a pod. But then inside, since we don't have to deal with, I would think, finalizers if this is a CRD. But since this is not a CRD, it's a core component, I can tweak the API to say, oh, this object is used by a pod. I will throw you an error. You cannot delete that. It's used by a pod.
Yeah, so from the from the functionality point of view, I make sense. But I'm really wondering who cares about that. I mean that the core Kubernetes, I mean that the KCM will care about that, or provider needs to be care about that by having the admission control or something.
Exactly. So who would care? I would say just the, and this is something that maybe someone will push back from the API side, saying that, oh, this is a very custom handling, we should not do this. Maybe that will be the case, and then okay, maybe not. But who would care? I would say the sanity of like user experience. All right, so I have a pod, and I assume with today with Multus, network attachment definition can be deleted, right, Tomo?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine I created my network, I created my pod that references a network NAD, and then the pod is up and running, and then I deleted that NAD, right? And now I'm looking at the pod, what you are connected to, and now, okay, where is that NAD? And it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So I don't have the state of that guy, right? Or if you see, that's the problem, and then it's up to your implementation to handle it, right? So what I mean by that is, okay, if you delete that object, I will do something about this. Right now, you decided to do nothing. But imagine if I want to be like a properly sanitized thing, to have some properly sanitization, what I will do, if you try to delete this object, let's say I will just delete all the pods with that network, because that can be one of the decisions for the implementation as well.
Yeah.
So
for each
that will be the you.
Okay, so for each provider, they may care about some of the stuff, but in the generic case, I mean that as you mentioned in the SCAP, all providers care there is no difference among the providers at that time. The pod network
at this point it doesn't matter. Yes, yeah.
And then the pod network is cannot be removed when the one or more pod is used. So this should be, I mean that this is a pretty common stuff. So maybe these stuff should be care about the core Kubernetes as the functionality, I think.
Yeah,
otherwise maybe each provider may skipping or some or stuff. So I'm pretty afraid that.
Yeah, so that's what the reason as well, right? Eventually, maybe some providers will have the capability of what I want to say of mutation of the object in any way, or do something special.
Maybe the provider, the several provider could add the additional functionality, but this tool is the pretty minimum, and then this is the required.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm trying to say is, if someone eventually gets there, that, oh, I need this, they will have to just create a cap and say, okay, let's loosen up this requirement because we have a means to now be more dynamic. But I think that should be like in 3 years if someone comes up with something and will try to kind of create that. Nathan?
Maybe a question somewhat related to that. Do we want, so we have status for networks coming up. Do we also want to expose statuses for networks going down? So being removed, so maybe basically provide a way for the implementation to tell that network is being deleted and that network is fully deleted now. The reason I'm thinking about that is if objects are immutable, people wanting to update the objects will probably delete and recreate.
Mm-hmm.
And probably race condition can happen in those areas. So
what do you have in mind? What race condition you have in mind? Because if those two conditions together, right? If I don't have any pod referencing this network, what sort of race condition you have in mind? Is it for pod referencing it, or is it about between synchronies? Yeah,
the network itself being created. I don't. So maybe when say it's not a problem and say it's up to the implementation to handle this internally. I was thinking about programming a physical device or something like that you will need to wait before it has happened before being able to do it again. But
so
we can say it.
So this is depending on how far you want to go with that, right? That's why if you have the parameters reference, you could always do this and gate it through the params ready, right? That's what you're saying, that I need to program some data plane, right? So I have a centralized, and this, keep in mind, this has to be in centralized means, right? It cannot be per node, it's only in centralized ways. We will get in phase 2 a case where we want to do status per node, where, okay, this node is still programming, and then only then I will report something to the node stating this network is ready on the node. I want to get there. So maybe that will help you with what you're saying, because then we can indicate readiness of a network per node. And this is something that we want to, and this is one of the requirements. This is phase 2, where we have a selective availability of the network in the cluster, right? So maybe that should probably support and help better your case. Keep in mind, this is all centralized, so be mindful of that. That's the case.
Well, I was more thinking about. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I was going to extend what you were saying. Is there is one use case that maybe we might want to consider, which is what happens when we want to get rid of a network. So I've got a network out there. There's 100 pods on it, and I'm now going to shut down and make that network inaccessible. Now I can't just delete it because pods are relying on it, but I do want to maybe stop pods being scheduled on it. Is there a way of doing that with this?
That's a fair point. So no, like now we wouldn't have that ability, right? What you want to do is block creation of new pods on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that ultimately I can delete it when I have manually gone through and found all those pods and deleted them or whatever.
Should there be a sorry, Doug, but should we have another flag inside the spec to indicate like up, down, and that field can be non-mutable? Should there be that like a administrative up, down of a and then basically that will indicate, that flag would indicate readiness, right? With control readiness, stating that if the flag is down, then I switch my readiness flag down because and there will be another reason administratively down. Should that be the case? Because I see, Pete, that's a fair use case, and we don't have a means to prevent. Okay, don't create anymore. It's like with the today draining capabilities, right? Inside pods and deployments, we do have some sort of ability to state, okay, no more new connections to that workload because I'm deleting it.
The other area where it's something like that might be interesting is, I'm just thinking of error conditions. If I want to delete my network, so I want to delete my network, but I can't delete my network because there's some pods on it, but I can't delete those pods because the node's in a bad state. Those kind of conditions. I don't know if there are error cases there that are going to be problematic. Being able to at least say, stop putting pods on this network so I can clean them up and delete it might be very useful. So
should
I
that
don't know
be?
if we need it at this stage, but it's certainly something that feels like it might be useful.
So now the other thing when I think about it, metadata has delete timestamp, right? If I were to delete the object, we will block the deletion, but we will set, we can set the deletion timestamp, and that can be the indicator that I'm deleting this object, and then basically I would set my ready to deletion in progress or something like that, right? Because I should we do that? Let me write it up.
I like that actually. I think that would cover the use case. It covers both. It means that if I want to delete it and there are pods, I can do the delete and say, right, nothing else goes on this, and then out of band, I can get rid of the pods, and once the pods are gone, it'll clear up.
Yeah, and then the reason will indicate that deletion in progress, and then ready will be false, and then it will be up to the implementation how they handle it, right? Whether they do whatever they do, right? But basically that will mean that it's up to your implementation, and we'll have that signal. Okay, let me try to add that.
That sounds good.
The reason. Any other comments on this? On that immutability and that removal? Silence as an acceptance as usual. Okay, let's move on. Good, I wrote this whole up because we are we are going crazy today, going fast. We have 4 more minutes.
And
Yeah,
so
there was a question.
Cannot be removed when one pod is referencing it, right? So if you think of Unix file system and so on, you can remove the file, but that doesn't remove the reference to the file object that disappears when the last reference to it is. But to say that you cannot do a management operation until sort of specific running condition have been met is a little bit weird.
So the comparison
with
file.
How do I know if I ever can remove a network? Because how do you stop someone from attaching to it?
So this is what we were saying, right? Via deletion timestamp. Yeah, that was what Pete was bringing up as well, how you would indicate that. But I would, you want to, when you delete the object, we will set the deletion timestamp, right? And then,
okay.
And then deletion timestamps with if you have that field set, we would change the readiness to deletion in progress.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I can't really see today, so I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I will update. I left myself a comment to add a new reason for readiness to say that, okay, we are trying to delete this object. And just the fact, keep in mind that that will mean that just the fact of me deleting the object makes the object not ready. That's how it will behave. That will be a very non-standard, like if you think about pods, that is not the case for pods, right? Pods will say that pods is ready because it's controlled by its readiness flag. And this will be completely differently of how that will behave. Okay.
Yeah, because right, this is probably reference a network. So yeah, it's fine. It's nothing that's going to stop anyone from removing the availability of a network on a node, right? But that's outside the what we can specify here anyway.
Yeah,
that's fine. Sorry for.
No, that's fine. All right. Any other comments on that deletion? Okay, so moving on. So we have last minute. I just want to kind of note a default network here, and I did add it copied from our the cap here at the top terminology. Something that keep in mind that we are introducing two new terms here. So we have a cluster default pod network, and this is the network that today's clusters are created with. So there is a cluster default network. So this is, and that network will be, this is what I'm describing below. This is the default network. And then the notion of a primary network. This is the network inside the pod, which has the default gateway set. So basically today, default network is the primary network all the time. That's because we have only one network. It's always the default gateway. Jesper.
No, so I think you need to clarify it a little more, because there's nothing that you can have many default routes if you use VRFs, right? So just don't do it now, but I think it needs to be more precise.
On a default, okay, VRF, yeah.
You see what I mean, right? If I start using VRFs, I will have one default route per VRF.
Let me just say that interface is used to the default gateway on the. Is that table 1, or does just if I say default VRF, that will be sufficient?
I think that should sort of that should be enough for now. We can figure. I will think of something better, but at least yeah.
I will give you a comment.
And Linus, they don't call the default thing VRF, they call it L3 context or something like that, but who cares?
Left you a comment to look at it.
Sorry, the time seems to be up, but so maybe from at the next meeting, let's talk about the default network. I'm a little bit wondering that some customer some user wants to create the network without the default network. I mean that, like the closed network.
Yeah,
they do not have the default gateway at that time.
That's yes. Let's get there. But I think we are not currently, when we're gonna go to pod attachments. I think we are not doing that. And by the way, I did. Yeah, let's end at this. I will add a pointer that we're gonna continue from the default network. But anyone, please, I did added discussion, some text on the how I'm thinking of to attach to a pod, our pod network to a pod. So how to change the pod spec, how that would look like, and then some status reporting about this. So please read through that and leave comments. So that's something that we can discuss next week. I will update this more because we are going quite fast. So I will try to add even more on the next thing. I think what I need to add on is attach and the RBAC, how we will handle that. So that's the next thing. And of course, if something's missing anywhere, please let me know, or try to add stuff on by yourself, because that's kind of, as we go, I'm thinking about some of those, but maybe I'm missing something. So I'm not trying to just dictate what has to be handled. Maybe there are some other use cases that we need to look at. So please help me with this. All right, let's call it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.